The Eden Conservatory did not host parties, it curated experiences. On this crisp San Francisco evening, the vast, glass-domed structure was transformed into a living jewel box, a sanctuary where nature's quiet elegance met the city's performative wealth. The air was a delicate symphony of damp earth, night-blooming jasmine, and the subtle, expensive perfumes of its guests. A string quartet, tucked away in a bower of ferns, played a soft, unobtrusive melody that served as the soundtrack for hushed conversations and the clinking of champagne flutes. This was a world of cultivated beauty, a place where even the charity was impeccably landscaped. Away from the main throng, in the quiet solitude of the Orchid Pavilion, Elara Vance stood motionless. She was captivated by a single, impossibly rare specimen, a ghost orchid, its spectral white petals suspended in the humid air like a fragment of a dream. At 29, Elara possessed a stillness that was often mistaken for shyness. She wore a simple, sleeveless linen dress the color of moss, its fabric a stark, organic contrast to the glittering sequins and silks that dominated the room. She wore no jewelry, save for the thin, almost invisible silver chain around her neck, a gift from her husband. Her beauty was like the orchid she admired, natural, understated, and easily overlooked by those searching for something more ostentatious. The quiet reverence of the moment was shattered by a wave of loud, brittle laughter. Beatrice Croft and her coterie of society wives swept into the pavilion, a tempest of designer gowns and sharp, cloying scents. They moved with the aggressive confidence of women who believed their wealth entitled them to occupy any space at any volume. Beatrice, the undisputed queen of her circle, was a formidable presence. At 48, she was a masterpiece of surgical enhancement and relentless self-maintenance, her blonde hair coiffed into a perfect immobile helmet, her diamonds catching the light with a cold, hard fire. Her gaze swept the room, assessing and dismissing, until it landed on the quiet, simply dressed figure of Elara. Beatrice paused, a look of profound, theatrical confusion on her face. She leaned toward one of her companions, a woman draped in enough gold to fund a small nation, and whispered, her voice a stage whisper designed to carry, "My goodness, I think one of the catering staff has gotten lost." The other women tittered, their laughter a soft, cruel counterpoint to the string quartet's melody. Beatrice glided toward Elara, her smile a perfect, predatory curve. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes raking over Elara's simple linen dress with undisguised contempt. "Excuse me, dear," she said, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that was far more insulting than an outright shout. "I think you've wandered into the wrong area. The service entrance is around the back, you know." Elara slowly turned from the orchid, her gaze calm and steady. She took in the sight of Beatrice, the expensive dress, the blinding jewelry, the perfectly arranged mask of superiority, and felt not a flicker of intimidation. She had spent her life studying ecosystems, and she knew a predator when she saw one. They were often the most beautifully adorned creatures in the forest, their plumage a warning of the poison that lay beneath. She offered Beatrice a small, polite smile, a gesture of quiet, unassailable composure. "Thank you for your concern," Elara said, her voice a low, gentle murmur that forced the other women to lean in to hear. "But I can assure you, I am exactly where I'm meant to be." The response was so unexpected in its simple, direct refusal to be dismissed, so utterly devoid of the flustered apology Beatrice had anticipated, that it momentarily stunned her into silence. The smile on Beatrice's face faltered for a fraction of a second. She had expected a mouse and had instead found a still, quiet stone, one that refused to be moved. The quiet defiance in Elara's eyes was a challenge, and for a woman like Beatrice Croft, a challenge was a declaration of war. The love story of Elara Vance and Elias Thorne was not one chronicled in society pages or whispered about at exclusive clubs. It was a quiet, rooted thing, born not in a ballroom, but in the muddy, mosquito-infested humidity of the Costa Rican rainforest. Elias, at the time, was already a legend in the tech world. The enigmatic founder of Viridian Dynamics, he had built a billion-dollar empire on a revolutionary algorithm that optimized energy consumption for entire cities. He was a man who lived in a world of data, of logic, of clean, predictable systems. But he had a secret passion, a quiet rebellion against the sterile world he had created. He invested millions of his personal fortune into reforestation projects, buying up vast tracts of land that had been ravaged by logging and funding the slow, arduous work of bringing them back to life. It was on one of these projects, knee-deep in mud while helping a local team plant saplings, that he had met her. Elara Vance was a doctoral candidate in botany from Berkeley, the lead researcher on a project studying the symbiotic relationship between native fungi and tree root systems. She was brilliant, fiercely intelligent, and possessed a quiet, almost spiritual connection to the natural world that Elias found both baffling and utterly captivating. He had watched her for days, a woman seemingly oblivious to his wealth and status, who spoke of mycelial networks with more passion than most people spoke of love. She moved through the rainforest with a quiet confidence, her hands constantly touching leaves, bark, and soil, as if she were reading a language he couldn't see. Their first real conversation had been an argument. He had proposed a new, technologically advanced irrigation system, a marvel of efficiency. She had calmly, and with irrefutable scientific data, explained how his perfect system would disrupt the delicate subterranean ecosystem and kill the very trees he was trying to save. She had dismantled his multi-million-dollar plan with a quiet, devastating logic. And in that moment, Elias Thorne, a man who had never lost a boardroom battle, found himself completely, irrevocably in love. He had been drawn not just to her mind, but to her soul. Elara operated on a different value system. She measured wealth not in stock points, but in biodiversity. She saw success not as a conquered market, but as a restored ecosystem. She was a woman who had, in the most profound sense, found her place in the world, and it had nothing to do with the artificial hierarchies of human society. Their life together reflected her values. Despite his immense fortune, they lived not in a sprawling Bel Air mansion, but in a modest, beautiful home perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, a house made of reclaimed wood and glass that seemed to merge with the surrounding landscape. Their social life was not a calendar of galas and high-profile dinners, but a small, tight circle of academics, artists, and activists. Elias had traded the deafening noise of the financial world for the quiet, meaningful rhythm of a life with purpose. He adored her quiet strength, her unwavering integrity, her complete and utter indifference to the trappings of wealth that had, before meeting her, been the only way he measured his own worth. She had not just captured his heart, she had saved his soul. Tonight's gala was a rare, reluctant concession to his world. The Eden Conservatory was a major recipient of Viridian's philanthropic funding, and his presence was non-negotiable. Elara had agreed to attend, not for the social posturing, but because the cause, environmental conservation, was one she genuinely believed in. She had chosen her simple moss green dress with the same quiet intention she applied to everything, a subtle personal statement of her values in a room dedicated to artifice. Elias had understood completely. To him, in that simple linen dress, she was more radiant than any woman in the room draped in diamonds, because her beauty was not a decoration. It was a reflection of the profound, unshakable integrity of her spirit. And he knew, with a certainty that was the bedrock of his existence, that he was the luckiest man on earth to be the one who got to see it. Beatrice Croft returned to her circle of friends, a dismissive laugh already prepared on her lips. "You see," she murmured, taking a sip of her champagne, "some people just have no sense of occasion." Her friends nodded in dutiful agreement, their own expensive gowns rustling as they leaned in to dissect the minor scandal. But beneath the polished veneer of her contempt, something else was stirring in Beatrice, a cold, sharp spike of profound irritation. It wasn't just the woman's simple dress or her quiet defiance that bothered her. It was her ease. The woman, Elara, possessed a kind of effortless authenticity that Beatrice, for all her wealth and status, knew she could never replicate. Beatrice's entire identity was a carefully curated performance, a fortress built of designer labels and strategic alliances, and Elara's simple, unadorned presence felt like a silent judgment on its hollow foundation. Beatrice hadn't been born into this world of quiet power and inherited grace. She had fought her way into it. Her childhood was a landscape of faded floral sofas and the constant gnawing anxiety of bills piled on the kitchen table. She had scraped and clawed her way through a state college, fueled by a fierce, burning ambition to escape the suffocating mediocrity of her origins. She had learned early that in a world that valued appearances above all else, the right dress, the right friends, and the right husband were not just accessories. They were armor. Her marriage to Robert Croft, a moderately successful but perpetually anxious real estate developer, had been her masterstroke. He had the money, she had the ambition and the social acumen. Theirs was less a romance and more a merger, a partnership dedicated to the relentless acquisition of status. She had sculpted their lives, managed their social ascent, and transformed the name Croft from merely well-off to a name that warranted an invitation to events like this. And tonight, more than ever, that status was critical. She scanned the room until she found him. Robert stood near the bar, locked in a tense, smiling conversation with another developer. His posture was just a little too stiff, his smile a little too wide. Beatrice knew the signs. He was nervous. He was desperate. The contract to build the new West Coast headquarters for Viridian Dynamics was not just another deal for Robert. It was a lifeline. His last two projects had been over budget and underwhelming. His company was leveraged to the hilt. Securing the Viridian contract, a project worth hundreds of millions, would not just save his company, it would catapult them into the next stratosphere of wealth and influence. And the key to that contract was the elusive, almost reclusive Elias Thorne. Beatrice had spent weeks planning for this night. She had researched every guest, memorized every connection, and orchestrated their chance encounter with Thorne with the precision of a military campaign. The gala was not a party. It was a high-stakes negotiation, and she was the lead strategist. And now, this quiet, unassuming woman in a plain green dress had become an unexpected, irritating variable. She was a distraction, a piece on the board that didn't fit, and Beatrice's entire strategy was built on controlling every single piece. Elias Thorne was the prize, and anyone who diverted his attention, anyone who didn't play by the established rules of this glittering, savage game, was not just an annoyance, they were a threat. She watched as Elara moved gracefully to another part of the pavilion, her quiet presence a stark, infuriating contrast to Beatrice's brittle performance. She thinks she's better than us, Beatrice thought, the idea a hot, bitter poison. With her simple dress and her quiet little smile, she thinks she's above all this. Beatrice finished her champagne in a single sharp gulp. She would not let this nobody, this stray, ruin the most important night of her life. She would reassert control. She would remind everyone in this room, including the quiet woman by the orchids, who held the real power. It was a decision born of deep-seated insecurity and fueled by a desperate, all-consuming fear of falling. And it was a decision that would lead her, in a matter of minutes, to a point of no return. The sight of Elias Thorne, still deeply engaged in conversation with a group of potential donors across the pavilion, was the final catalyst Beatrice needed. Her husband, Robert, was still circling, trying to find his own opening to approach the tech billionaire. To Beatrice, Elara's continued calm presence was a direct threat to their meticulously planned evening. She decided, with a surge of righteous indignation, to put an end to the distraction once and for all. She left her friends with a dismissive wave and made a direct path to where Elara stood, once again admiring the rare flora. This time, there was no pretense of politeness in her approach. Her steps were sharp, her posture aggressive, her smile gone, replaced by a tight, thin line of unconcealed annoyance. "I thought I made myself clear," Beatrice began, her voice a low, venomous hiss. "This area is for the guests, not the help." Elara turned slowly, her expression unchanged. It was this infuriating calm, this refusal to be rattled, that drove Beatrice to the edge. It was as if her sharpest daggers were bouncing off some invisible, impenetrable shield. "And as I said," Elara replied, her voice still a soft, even murmur, "I am a guest." Beatrice let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A guest? In that sad little dress? Darling, please, don't embarrass yourself. I don't know what you're trying to accomplish here, but it's over. I suggest you find a back exit before you're thrown out." "I have no intention of leaving," Elara stated simply. The finality in her tone, the quiet, absolute refusal to be dismissed, was the spark that ignited Beatrice's carefully contained rage. All the insecurity, all the ambition, all the desperate, clawing need to maintain her position in a world she felt she had only barely conquered, it all coalesced into a single, ugly point of fury directed at this one woman. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Beatrice sneered, taking a step closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "Showing up here looking all humble and pure, trying to catch the eye of someone important. I've seen your kind before. You think you can use that quiet little act to manipulate your way into a world you could never afford." "My value isn't determined by my clothing, Mrs. Croft," Elara said, her voice still quiet, but now laced with a strength that was as unyielding as the ancient trees outside. "And I am not here to impress anyone. I am simply here." That was it. That was the final affront. The simple declaration of her own right to exist in this space, without apology or explanation, was a rejection of Beatrice's entire worldview. It was a truth so profound that Beatrice could not absorb it, and so she tried to destroy it. "You insolent nobody," she spat, her face contorting with a rage that was ugly and raw. And then she moved. Her hand, adorned with a diamond the size of a robin's egg, flew through the air. The movement was shockingly fast, a vicious, uncontrolled arc of violence in a room dedicated to peace and beauty. The sound, the sharp, ugly crack of palm against skin, was an obscenity. It echoed through the orchid pavilion, a sound so out of place, so brutal that it seemed to create a vacuum into which all the music and chatter of the gala was violently sucked. Every head turned, conversations died, champagne flutes froze halfway to lips. Elara stumbled back a step from the force of the blow, her hand flying to her cheek. A bright crimson mark bloomed instantly against her warm brown skin. But she did not cry. She did not scream. She simply stared at Beatrice, and the look in her eyes was not one of fear or pain. It was a look of profound, almost clinical pity. Beatrice stood there, her chest heaving, her hands still tingling from the impact, a look of wild, triumphant fury on her face. For a single, terrible moment, she believed she had won. She had finally broken through the other woman's infuriating calm. She had put her in her place. She did not yet realize that the sound of that slap had not just been an act of assault. It had been a summons. From across the room, Elias Thorne's head had snapped up, his conversation cut short. He had seen it. He had seen Beatrice's hand connect with his wife's face. For a single frozen second, he stood motionless, his mind processing the impossible, unthinkable act. Then his face, which had been a mask of pleasant professional engagement, transformed. The warmth vanished, replaced by a glacial calm that was far more terrifying than any shout. He set his champagne flute down on a nearby table with a click that was as sharp and final as a judge's gavel. "Elias," Adona began, but the word died in his throat as Elias turned and began to walk. He moved not with the hurried gait of an angry man, but with the slow, deliberate, and unstoppable pace of an avalanche. Every person in his path, every glittering guest and society scion seemed to melt away, clearing a path for him as if by instinct. The entire conservatory held its breath, a collective, silent witness to the storm that was about to break. And the look on his face was not one of a benefactor. It was the look of a king whose queen had just been struck in his own court. The walk across the pavilion felt like a lifetime. The soft strains of the string quartet had faltered and then died completely, leaving behind a silence that was thick and electric. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic tap of Elias Thorne's Italian leather shoes against the marble floor, a sound that seemed to mark the final ticking seconds of Beatrice Croft's carefully constructed world. Beatrice stood frozen, the triumphant fury on her face slowly curdling into a dawning, horrified confusion. She saw Elias approaching, saw the terrifying calm in his eyes, but her mind, still clouded with adrenaline and arrogance, could not yet make the connection. She assumed he was coming to address the disturbance, to restore order, perhaps even to reprimand the woman she had just assaulted. It did not occur to her, not for a single fleeting second, that the storm was coming for her. Elara had not moved. Her hand was still pressed to her cheek, the skin beneath her fingers throbbing with a dull, insistent fire. She watched her husband approach, and in his eyes she saw a side of him she had only glimpsed once or twice before. The cold, implacable resolve of the man who had built an empire by seeing 3 moves ahead of everyone else. She saw the protector, the avenger, the quiet, formidable force that lay beneath his gentle, intellectual exterior. Elias did not stop at Beatrice. He walked directly to Elara, his gaze softening for the briefest of moments as he took in the sight of the red mark blooming on her face. He did not speak to her, not yet. He simply stood beside her, a quiet, unshakable wall of support. And then he turned his full, undivided attention to the woman who had dared to strike his wife. The moment was a silent, powerful declaration. He had not come to mediate. He had come to stand with her. Beatrice stared, her mind finally, belatedly, connecting the impossible dots. The quiet, simply dressed woman. Elias Thorne's focused, protective rage. His complete and utter disregard for her own social standing. It was a puzzle whose pieces were assembling themselves into a picture of absolute catastrophic horror. "Elias," she stammered, her voice a weak, uncertain thing. "Mr. Thorne, you don't understand. This woman, she was being disruptive." Elias did not respond to her. He continued to look at her, his silence a more damning indictment than any words could ever be. He was letting her hang in the wind, forcing her to confront the enormity of her miscalculation in front of the silent, watching jury of her peers. The slap, which had been an act of power, was now revealed for what it truly was, a fatal, self-inflicted wound. The sound that had echoed through the conservatory was not the sound of a victim being put in her place. It was the sound of Beatrice Croft's own social and financial suicide. The onlookers, who had been frozen in shock, now began to react. Whispers, sharp and frantic, erupted throughout the room. "My God, did you see that? He's with her. Who is she?" "I have no idea. But Thorne looks ready to commit murder. That's Beatrice Croft. Her husband is trying to land the Viridian deal, or was." Beatrice heard the whispers, saw the shift in the room's atmosphere from shocked fascination to a dawning collective judgment. She had assaulted a nobody, and in doing so had apparently, impossibly, attacked the most important person in the room to the night's most important guest. She looked from Elias's cold, unforgiving face to Elara's quiet, pained dignity, and the full, terrifying scope of her mistake finally crashed down upon her. The floor seemed to drop out from beneath her feet. The glittering, beautiful world she had fought so hard to conquer was dissolving into a nightmare, and she was the sole architect of her own ruin. The storm had not just arrived. It had made landfall, and it was clear to everyone in the Eden Conservatory that nothing would ever be the same again. Elias Thorne's silence was a weapon, and he wielded it with a cold, devastating precision. He let the whispers in the room build, let the weight of Beatrice's catastrophic misjudgment settle upon her until it became a physical, crushing force. He watched as the color drained from her face, as her eyes darted around the room, desperately seeking an ally in a sea of suddenly averted gazes. Finally, when the tension in the pavilion had become an almost unbearable thing, he spoke. His first words were not to Beatrice, but to his wife. "Are you all right, my love?" he asked, his voice a low, gentle murmur that was a stark, intimate contrast to the public drama unfolding. He gently took Elara's hand from her cheek, his thumb brushing over the still angry mark with an infinite tenderness. The endearment, "my love," was a quiet, simple confirmation, but it landed in the room with the force of a thunderclap. It was the undeniable public claiming of this woman as his own. Elara looked up at him, her eyes still shimmering with the shock of the assault, but she gave a small, steady nod. "I'm okay," she whispered. Only then did Elias turn his gaze back to Beatrice. The softness in his expression vanished, replaced once more by that glacial, unnerving calm. "Beatrice," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent pavilion. "You seem to be under a misapprehension." Beatrice, now visibly trembling, could only stare, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "This woman," Elias continued, his arm now moving to rest protectively around Elara's shoulders, "is not lost. She is not a member of the catering staff, and she is not, as you so elegantly put it, a nobody." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, a slow, deliberate twisting of the knife. "This is Dr. Elara Vance-Thorne, my wife." The room erupted. A collective, audible gasp swept through the conservatory, a wave of pure, unadulterated shock. The whispers exploded into a frantic, buzzing cacophony. His wife, Vance-Thorne. But she's... The unfinished sentences hung in the air, thick with the prejudice and assumptions that had led to this very moment. Beatrice looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Your wife," she stammered, the words a pathetic, broken echo. But she can't be." The denial, born of sheer, panicked disbelief, was perhaps the most damning thing she could have said. It was a raw, unfiltered confession of her own bigotry. She couldn't be his wife because she didn't look like his wife. She didn't wear the right clothes, the right jewelry, the right skin. Elias's eyes narrowed, the last vestiges of his composure burning away to reveal the cold, hard fury beneath. "She can't be?" he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, almost predatory whisper. "And why is that, Beatrice? Because she possesses a genuine character that cannot be purchased? Because her worth is not measured in carats or couture? Or is it something simpler? Is it because a woman of color in your world is simply not permitted to hold this kind of position?" He did not wait for an answer. He didn't need one. He had laid her prejudice bare for all to see, and the silence from the surrounding crowd was a resounding verdict of guilt. The very people Beatrice had spent her life trying to impress were now staring at her with a mixture of horror, disgust, and a certain grim satisfaction. The brutal, unspoken hierarchies of their world had just been violently upended, and the spectacle was both terrifying and utterly captivating. The full, horrifying truth of her mistake was now crashing down on Beatrice Croft, and it was a truth from which there was no escape. She had not just insulted a guest, she had publicly assaulted the wife of the very man whose favor was the cornerstone of her family's future. The silence in the room was now thick with her humiliation, a suffocating blanket woven from the threads of her own arrogance. Elias, having exposed the root of her prejudice, now moved to the consequence. "This woman you just struck," he continued, his voice still a low, controlled current of fury, "is not just my wife. She is Dr. Elara Vance-Thorne, one of the most respected botanists in her field. Her research on neotropical ecosystems has been published in journals that I suspect you, Beatrice, would find too taxing to read." Each word was a precise, calculated blow, dismantling Beatrice's entire sense of superiority. He was not just defending Elara as his wife, he was championing her as an individual of formidable intellect and professional accomplishment. "Furthermore," Elias said, his gaze sweeping the room before landing back on Beatrice, "the very foundation this gala is intended to support, the Golden Gate Conservation Trust, was established a decade ago with a substantial anonymous grant. That grant, which has funded the preservation of thousands of acres of California's most vital habitats, was the first major philanthropic gift from the Vance-Thorne Environmental Fund." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "The fund, that my wife founded and personally directs." The room, which had been buzzing with shocked whispers, fell silent once more. The irony was breathtakingly brutal. Beatrice Croft, in her desperate attempt to police the boundaries of a world she felt entitled to, had just assaulted the quiet, unassuming architect of the very charity she was pretending to support. "So you see, Beatrice," Elias said, his voice dropping to an almost conversational tone that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "You were wrong. On every conceivable level, you misjudged her character, you misjudged her intellect, you misjudged her position. And you did it all because you looked at a woman of color in a simple dress and saw not a person, but a target for your own pathetic insecurities." Beatrice could not speak. A small, strangled sound escaped her throat, a pathetic whimper of a woman watching her entire world burn to the ground. She looked around, her eyes pleading for a lifeline, for someone to intervene, to stop this relentless public vivisection of her character. But no one moved. Her friends, the women who had tittered along with her insults just minutes before, now stared at their shoes, their champagne glasses, anywhere but at her. They were distancing themselves from her toxicity with the swift, merciless pragmatism of their class. She was no longer an ally. She was a liability, and in their world, liabilities were swiftly and silently cut loose. The social execution was complete. Model response. Of course. Here is Chapter 8, continuing the narrative for Video S10 and adhering to the established blueprint. Video S10. Chapter 8. Just as Beatrice seemed on the verge of complete collapse, a new figure entered the circle of confrontation. Robert Croft, his face pale and slick with a sheen of panicked sweat, hurried toward them, his earlier forced bonhomie replaced by a raw, naked terror. He had seen the commotion from across the room, had heard the deadly quiet in Elias Thorne's voice, and he knew, with the gut-wrenching certainty of a man watching his last hope go up in flames, that something catastrophic had occurred. "Elias," he said, his voice a strained, pleading thing. "Elias, what's going on? There seems to be some terrible misunderstanding." Elias turned his cold, unwavering gaze from Beatrice to her husband. "Misunderstanding, Robert," he repeated, the word tasting like an insult. "No, I don't think there's any misunderstanding at all. I think, for the first time, everything is perfectly, painfully clear." Robert looked at his wife, who was now openly weeping, her face a ruin of smeared makeup and shattered pride. "Beatrice, what did you do?" he whispered, though he already knew the answer. The guilty, horrified silence of the room was answer enough. Elias did not wait for her to respond. He addressed Robert directly, his voice shifting from personal fury to the cold, impersonal finality of a business execution. "The contract for the new Viridian Dynamics headquarters," he began, each word a hammer blow, "the one your company has been lobbying for the past 6 months. The one that I believe was the sole reason for your attendance here this evening." Robert's face went from pale to ashen. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to beg, but Elias held up a hand, silencing him. "Consider that contract and any possibility of any future business between our two firms to be permanently and irrevocably terminated." The pronouncement was absolute. There was no room for negotiation, no possibility of appeal. In the world of high-stakes business, a man's word was his bond, and Elias Thorne had just delivered a verdict from which there was no recovery. Robert staggered back a step, as if he had been physically struck. The Viridian contract wasn't just a deal, it was his salvation. It was the lifeline that was supposed to pull his struggling company back from the brink of insolvency. Without it, he was ruined. "Elias, please," he stammered, his desperation overriding all sense of pride. "You can't. My company, my employees, this will destroy us." "You should have considered that," Elias said, his voice utterly devoid of sympathy, "before your wife decided to publicly assault mine." He gestured around the room, at the dozens of phones that were still discreetly recording, at the faces of the city's most influential investors and power brokers who had witnessed every damning second. "The story of what happened here tonight will be on every financial blog by morning," Elias continued, his voice a cold, hard statement of fact. "The story of how the Crofts conduct themselves when they believe no one of consequence is watching. I suspect, Robert, that the Viridian contract will soon be the very least of your worries." The finality in his tone was crushing. Robert Croft looked at his weeping wife, at the smouldering wreckage of their ambitions, and he finally, truly understood. They had come to this glittering gala hoping to secure their future, and in a single, ugly, and unforgivable act of prejudice, they had not just lost a deal, they had lost everything. The House of Croft, so carefully constructed on a foundation of ambition and social climbing, had just crumbled into dust. The public execution was complete. The fallout, swift and merciless, had begun. Beatrice and Robert Croft were now social lepers, radioactive with the taint of their public disgrace. The very people who had air-kissed Beatrice's cheek upon her arrival now averted their gazes, their backs turning in a synchronized, silent shunning that was as brutal as any physical blow. Phones, which had been recording, were now texting. The story was already spreading beyond the walls of the conservatory, a digital wildfire leaping from one influential contact to the next. "Did you hear about Beatrice Croft? Utterly imploded. Thorne's wife, a botanist. Black. Who knew? The Viridian deal is dead. Croft is finished. The social and financial architecture of their lives was being dismantled in real time, one whispered conversation, one deleted contact, one rescinded invitation at a time. Robert Croft, a man whose entire identity was built on the perception of success, seemed to shrink in on himself, the confident developer replaced by a broken, desperate man. He looked at his wife, at the source of his ruin, and the look in his eyes was not one of comfort, but of cold, unforgiving fury. He took her arm, his grip hard and bruising, and without a word began to pull her through the crowd toward the exit, a forced, humiliating retreat from the world they had tried so hard to conquer. As they passed, a kind of corridor of silence opened before them. No one spoke to them, no one met their eyes. They were ghosts, already erased from the social ledger of the city. Elias watched them go, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. The protector in him, the husband, was sated. Justice of a swift and public kind had been served. But as he turned his attention back to Elara, he saw something in her expression that gave him pause. She was watching the Crofts' pathetic, hurried exit, and the look in her eyes was not one of triumph. It was not the look of a victor savoring the defeat of her enemy. It was a look of profound, aching sadness. The chaos of the Crofts' exit left a strange, hollow silence in its wake. The immediate drama was over, but the emotional and social shrapnel still hung in the air. Guests began to murmur among themselves, their conversations now a low, buzzing post-mortem of the evening's spectacular implosion. The string quartet, after a moment of uncertain silence, hesitantly began to play again, a fragile attempt to stitch the tattered fabric of the evening back together. Elias, his protective fury now beginning to subside, turned his full attention back to Elara. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked again, his voice now laced with a gentle concern that was reserved only for her. She looked up at him, her eyes still holding that unexpected sadness. "I'm not hurt, Elias. Not really." She gently touched her cheek, where the red mark was already beginning to fade. "But I don't feel victorious." He frowned, not quite understanding. "They got what they deserved, Elara. She humiliated you. She assaulted you. There are consequences for that kind of behavior." "I know," she said, her voice a quiet, thoughtful murmur. "But what I saw just now, a woman so terrified of being insignificant that she had to resort to cruelty. A man so desperate for a deal that he was willing to stand by and watch. They weren't powerful, Elias. They were just broken." The profound empathy in her words, the ability to see the wounded humanity beneath Beatrice's monstrous behavior, was a testament to the very quality that Elias had fallen in love with. In a room full of people who had just witnessed a satisfying social execution, his wife was the only one mourning the humanity of the condemned. Beatrice's desperate, panicked pleas for mercy began to echo in Elara's mind. "Please, I didn't know. I made a mistake. My family, my children." In the heat of the moment, the words had sounded like a pathetic attempt to evade responsibility. But now, in the quiet aftermath, Elara heard something else. The raw terror of a woman who had just lost everything she had built her life around, however hollow that life may have been. "She was begging, Elias," Elara whispered, more to herself than to him. "At the end, all that arrogance, all that hatred, it just collapsed into begging." It was at that moment that Elara made a decision, one that was not born of weakness or forgiveness, but of a strength that was far more profound than her husband's righteous anger. She looked up at him, her expression clear and resolute. "You said their business would be ruined, that he would likely face bankruptcy. Without the Viridian contract, it's almost a certainty," Elias confirmed, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. "Then we can't let that happen," she said simply. Elias stared at her, utterly baffled. "What? Elara, after what they did to you, you want to... what? Help them?" "I don't want to help them," she corrected gently. "I want to help the person Beatrice might be forced to become if she's given no other choice but to confront her own brokenness. Destroying them, Elias, is too easy. It lets them off the hook. It allows them to become martyrs in their own story, victims of the big bad billionaire. It doesn't force them to change." She took his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "You wanted to teach her a lesson. So did I. But what is the lesson here? That if you attack the wrong person, you lose your money? Or is it something deeper? Is it that cruelty, at its core, is a symptom of a profound spiritual poverty, and the only cure for that is a dose of radical, unexpected grace?" Elias looked at his wife, at the quiet, unshakable integrity that radiated from her, and he felt his own anger begin to recede, replaced by a sense of awe. He had been ready to burn their world to the ground to protect her. She, in her infinite wisdom, was suggesting that the real power lay not in wielding the fire, but in offering a single, cool cup of water to the vanquished. It was not a promise to save their company, she explained. It was not an offer of forgiveness. It was an opportunity for a different kind of consequence, one that was not about punishment, but about the long, difficult, and transformative work of atonement. She had planted a seed, a possibility for a different, more meaningful, and ultimately more just ending to this story. An ending that wasn't about the satisfying, brutal finality of revenge, but about the quiet, difficult, and world-changing power of redemption. The days that followed were a quiet storm of their own. The story of the slap at the gala became a legend in San Francisco's elite circles, whispered about in hushed, cautionary tones. The Crofts, as Elias had predicted, had vanished from the social scene, their names conspicuously absent from guest lists, their calls to former friends and allies suddenly going unanswered. The Viridian deal was officially dead, and the financial vultures were already beginning to circle Robert Croft's struggling company. Beatrice and Robert found themselves in a new, terrifying reality. The glittering world they had fought so hard to be a part of had ejected them with a swift and merciless finality. They were now pariahs, their carefully constructed lives crumbling around them. In their cavernous, silent mansion, the recriminations began. The marriage, which had always been a business partnership disguised as a romance, could not withstand the pressure of their shared failure. Robert, his face a mask of bitter, impotent rage, blamed Beatrice for her recklessness, for her uncontrollable arrogance that had cost them everything. "Did you really think you could assault Elias Thorne's wife and there would be no consequences?" he had roared at her the night after the gala. "All our work, everything we built, gone, because you couldn't control your petty, pathetic prejudices for a single evening." Beatrice, stripped of her social armor, had no defense. She retreated into a state of shattered, weeping despair, the formidable socialite replaced by a broken, terrified woman who had lost the only thing that gave her life meaning, her status. Their home, once a stage for their social triumphs, was now a claustrophobic battleground of blame and regret. It was into this wreckage that Elara's message arrived. It was not a phone call or a legal notice. It was a simple, handwritten note, delivered by a courier to the Crofts' front door. The note was addressed to Robert, but Elara knew Beatrice would read it. "Mr. Croft," it began, Elara's script a model of elegant clarity. "I am aware of the financial difficulties your company is facing. While Viridian Dynamics' decision regarding the headquarters contract is final, the Vance-Thorne Environmental Fund is prepared to offer a different kind of partnership. We are launching a new initiative to fund the construction of a series of community gardens and low-income housing units in the Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood. It is a project that requires a developer with expertise in navigating the city's complex zoning laws. We would be willing to consider Croft Properties for the contract under one condition. The project must be personally overseen on-site by your wife, Beatrice Croft. She will be required to manage the community outreach, liaise with the neighborhood councils, and be the primary point of contact for the residents. It is a role that will require humility, patience, and a genuine commitment to serving a community she might once have overlooked. The choice is yours. Sincerely, Dr. Elara Vance-Thorne. The letter was a masterpiece of strategic grace. It was not an offer of a bailout. It was an offer of a lifeline, but one that came with a profound and difficult condition. It was a chance for Robert to save his company, but only if Beatrice was willing to embark on a journey of profound public atonement. When Robert read the letter, he saw only the business opportunity, a desperate, unexpected chance to avoid ruin. He stormed into the bedroom where Beatrice had been sequestered for days. "You're going to do this," he had said, thrusting the letter at her. "You're going to take this charity project, and you're going to save us. After the mess you made, it's the least you can do." For Beatrice, the letter was not a lifeline. It was the ultimate humiliation. To go from commanding society galas to managing a construction project in the city's poorest neighborhood, to be forced to serve the very people she had spent her life despising, it was a fate she considered worse than bankruptcy. But she had no choice. Her husband's fury, the cold, unforgiving reality of their financial ruin, and the silent, judging eyes of a city that had cast her out, it all cornered her. And so, with a heart full of bitterness and resentment, she agreed. She would take their charity, their pity project. She would perform this act of public penance, but she would do it on her own terms, her spirit still unbroken, her pride wounded but not yet extinguished. She did not yet understand that this was not a punishment. It was the beginning of her salvation. Elara stood on a windswept, sun-drenched lot in Bayview Hunters Point, the salty air from the nearby bay whipping strands of her hair across her face. Beside her, Elias wrapped a protective arm around her shoulders, his presence a quiet, steady anchor. Before them, a small, diverse group had gathered. Community activists, neighborhood council members, a few local journalists, and, standing awkwardly at the edge of the crowd, a pale and visibly uncomfortable Beatrice Croft. This was the official groundbreaking ceremony for the Bayview Roots project. It was a modest affair, no champagne or string quartets, just a few folding chairs, a thermos of coffee, and a collection of shiny new shovels tied with green ribbons. An elderly woman, a respected community leader named Maria Reyes, stepped forward to speak. Her voice, though softened by age, was filled with a powerful, unwavering strength. "For years," she began, her gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, "we have been promised things. We have been promised better parks, cleaner air, safer homes. And for years, those promises have been broken. Today, we are not here for another promise. We are here to begin the work." She then introduced Elara, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as a partner and a friend to our community. Elara stepped forward, her simple linen dress a familiar, comforting sight. She spoke not of charity, but of collaboration. "This project is not ours to give," she said, her voice clear and earnest. "It is ours to build together. The Vance-Thorne Fund is providing the resources, but the vision, the strength, and the heart of this project will come from you, the residents of Bayview." Finally, she turned her attention to Beatrice, and overseeing the day-to-day work, ensuring that the community's voice is heard at every stage, will be our project lead, Mrs. Beatrice Croft. A few of the community members exchanged skeptical glances. They had read the papers. They knew the story of the gala, of the slap, of the woman who had been publicly disgraced. To them, her presence here felt like a bizarre, unwelcome intrusion. Beatrice stepped forward, a forced, brittle smile plastered on her face. She was wearing a pair of designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most of the residents' monthly rent. She read from a prepared statement, her voice a monotone of rehearsed contrition, speaking of second chances, and the opportunity to give back. The words were correct, but they were hollow, devoid of genuine feeling. Elara knew this would be the hardest part. The community's trust was not a given. It would have to be earned, one difficult, humbling day at a time. And Beatrice's journey had to begin not with a speech, but with the work itself. After the speeches, Maria Reyes handed Beatrice a shovel. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Mrs. Croft," she said, her dark eyes missing nothing. "The work starts now." And in that moment, under the harsh, unforgiving sunlight, with a shovel in her soft, uncalloused hands and the skeptical eyes of an entire community upon her, Beatrice Croft's public penance and her private, unforeseen transformation officially began. She took the shovel, its rough wooden handle a foreign object in her grasp, and plunged it into the hard, unyielding earth. The work was just beginning. The first few weeks of the Bayview Roots project were a quiet, brutal form of torture for Beatrice Croft. The world she had once commanded from a velvet armchair was gone, replaced by the unforgiving reality of cracked pavement, chain-link fences, and the constant grinding noise of a community struggling to survive. She arrived each morning in her pristine Range Rover, a gleaming, incongruous symbol of wealth in a neighborhood of dented sedans and city buses. She would step out in her carefully chosen work attire, designer jeans, immaculate boots, a cashmere sweater still smelling faintly of her Bel Air closet, and find herself utterly, completely useless. Her role, as defined by the project charter Elara had drafted, was not to command, but to listen. She was to attend the daily community planning meetings, take notes, and serve as the liaison between the residents and her husband's construction crews. But in those meetings, held in a stuffy, fluorescent-lit room at the local community center, she was an outsider, a ghost at the feast. The residents, led by the formidable Maria Reyes, did not trust her. They spoke to her with a polite, impenetrable wall of civility, their eyes holding the quiet, weary skepticism of a people who had been let down too many times before. They did not shout at her or insult her. They simply, and with a quiet, devastating effectiveness, ignored her opinions. They spoke around her, through her, as if she were a piece of transparent, irrelevant furniture. For Beatrice, a woman whose entire identity was built on being seen, on commanding attention, this invisibility was a punishment far more profound than any financial loss. She would sit through hours of discussions about zoning variances, soil quality, and playground safety, her contributions met with polite nods and then promptly disregarded. The physical labor, though she was not required to participate, became a constant, silent rebuke. She watched as men and women half her age and a fraction of her wealth hauled lumber, mixed concrete, and planted vegetable gardens with a kind of joyful, communal effort that was completely foreign to her. She saw calloused hands stained with earth and sweat, creating something real, something tangible, while her own soft, manicured hands clutched a useless, unread binder. One afternoon, desperate to feel some sense of agency, she tried to offer a suggestion. "I was thinking," she began, her voice too loud in the quiet rhythm of the work, "that perhaps we could plant some ornamental roses along the front entrance. It would greatly improve the aesthetic." Maria Reyes, who was on her knees, patiently showing a young boy how to plant a tomato seedling, looked up at her, her face beaded with sweat, her eyes holding no malice, only a weary amusement. "Mrs. Croft," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "we are not building a country club. We are building homes. We are planting food. Aesthetics are a luxury we will consider after our children have a safe place to play and fresh vegetables to eat." The rebuke was not unkind, but it was absolute. Beatrice retreated, her cheeks burning with a familiar but now impotent shame. She was a woman who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing, and in this world, value was the only currency that mattered. Her transformation was not a single dramatic epiphany. It was a slow, grinding erosion of her former self. It was the daily, humbling realization that her designer clothes were absurdly impractical, that her social acumen was useless, that the power she had once wielded had no purchase here. It was the small, unexpected moments of grace that began to chip away at her armor. The day a young mother offered her a bottle of cold water without a word. The afternoon an elderly man explained to her, with a quiet, scholarly passion, the history of the neighborhood. The moment a little girl, seeing her standing alone and awkward, took her hand and led her over to see a ladybug crawling on a newly planted kale leaf. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Beatrice began to change. She started leaving the Range Rover a few blocks away and walking to the site. She traded her cashmere for a simple, durable work coat. She started listening in the meetings, not with the intent to control, but with a dawning, genuine curiosity. She began to see not a blighted neighborhood, but a community of resilient, resourceful, and profoundly dignified people. She was, for the first time in her life, beginning to see the world not through the lens of her own ambition, but through the clear, unforgiving, and ultimately healing eyes of others. 6 months after the groundbreaking, the Bayview Roots project was no longer just a construction site. It was a thriving, vibrant testament to the community's resilience. The low-income housing units, built with a clean, modern aesthetic, were nearly complete. The community garden, once a barren, windswept lot, was now a lush, green oasis, its neat rows of vegetables a testament to 100 pairs of dedicated hands. And at the heart of it all, a figure once unimaginable was now a familiar, almost beloved presence. Beatrice Croft had become, to her own profound astonishment, a part of the community. She no longer arrived in a Range Rover, but in a modest, used sedan. Her designer wardrobe had been replaced by practical work pants, sturdy boots, and a collection of simple, comfortable sweaters. The brittle, arrogant socialite had been worn away, eroded by months of humbling, meaningful work, revealing a woman who was quieter, softer, and more genuine than she had ever been in her life. She knew the names of the children who played in the newly built playground. She knew which families needed extra vegetables from the community harvest. She had sat in the living rooms of the residents, listening to their stories, their struggles, their hopes. She had learned to measure her days not in social victories, but in small, tangible acts of service. Her relationship with her husband had undergone its own quiet transformation. Robert, having narrowly avoided bankruptcy, had found a new, more sober kind of ambition. He and Beatrice now spoke not of deals and status, but of budgets for the community centre and the schedule for the new literacy program. The crisis that had nearly destroyed them had, in the end, given them something they'd never had before, a shared, meaningful purpose. One crisp, sunny afternoon, as Beatrice was helping a group of teenagers mulch the garden beds, a familiar, quiet figure appeared at the edge of the project site. It was Elara. She had visited the project several times over the past few months, always quietly, always as an observer, her presence a gentle, supportive backdrop. But today she had come alone. Beatrice saw her and straightened up, wiping the sweat and dirt from her brow with the back of her hand. She walked over, a genuine, unforced smile on her face. "Elara," she said, the name no longer feeling like a symbol of her humiliation, but the name of a person she had, against all odds, come to respect. Beatrice, Elara replied, her own smile warm and kind. It's looking beautiful, more beautiful than I ever imagined. It's the people, Beatrice said simply, gesturing to the bustling activity around them. They're the ones who made it beautiful. I just carried the water. The two women stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, a silence that was a universe away from the tense, hostile quiet of their first meeting. I wanted to thank you, Beatrice said finally, her voice low and earnest. Not for the project, not for saving my husband's company, but for this. She gestured again to the garden, to the new homes, to the laughing children. You didn't have to do this. You could have destroyed us, and no one would have blamed you. But you gave me a chance to become someone else. Elara looked at Beatrice, at the genuine humility and gratitude in her eyes, and she felt a profound sense of rightness. This was the lesson her husband's anger could never have taught. This was the healing that retribution could never have achieved. You were the one who did the work, Beatrice, Elara said softly. All I did was open a door. You were the one who had the courage to walk through it. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, but they were not the tears of a broken, humiliated woman. They were the tears of a woman who had, in the most unexpected of ways, finally, truly, found her way home. The two women stood together, the former adversaries, now quiet, respectful partners in a shared, constructive peace. The gala, the slap, the public disgrace. It all felt like a story from another lifetime, about a person who no longer existed. In the rich, dark soil of Bayview, something new had been planted, and it had, against all odds, taken root and begun to bloom. The dawn of a new day was here. Years melted into a season of quiet, purposeful growth. The Bayview Roots Project became a model for urban renewal, a testament to the power of a community-led vision. Beatrice Croft, once its reluctant overseer, was now its most passionate advocate, her name synonymous not with scandal, but with a quiet, effective form of service. The story of her transformation became a quiet legend in its own right, a story of a woman who had lost a hollow crown and in doing so had found a genuine soul. Elara and Elias Thorne continued their work, their partnership a quiet, formidable force for good. The Vance-Thorne Fund became a global leader in ethical investing, its philosophy rooted in the simple, powerful idea that true profit was measured not in dollars, but in the well-being of the planet and its people. They never sought the spotlight, their names rarely appearing in headlines, but their influence was a deep, steady current, reshaping coastlines, restoring forests, and quietly, fundamentally changing the world. One cool, late autumn afternoon, Elara and Elias sat on the porch of their home overlooking the Pacific. The air was crisp, the sky a vast clear blue, and the ocean below a deep, peaceful slate. Elias had his arm around her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, a familiar, comforting weight. He was looking at a small framed photograph on the table beside them. It was a picture taken at the Bayview Project's one-year anniversary. In it, a smiling Beatrice stood arm in arm with Maria Reyes, a bouquet of freshly harvested sunflowers in her hands. I still think about that night, Elias said, his voice a low, thoughtful murmur. The anger I felt. I was ready to burn their whole world to the ground. Elara leaned her head against his shoulder. "I know," she said softly. "But fire only clears the land. It doesn't plant the seeds." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze still on the photograph. "You taught me that," he said. "You taught me that the greatest strength isn't the power to destroy. It's the courage to cultivate." He turned to her, his green eyes filled with a love that was deeper and more profound than it had been on the day they met. "You didn't just save her that night, Elara. You saved a part of me too, the part that was in danger of becoming as hard and unforgiving as the world I was trying to fight." She smiled, a slow, gentle curve of her lips that held all the wisdom and grace of their shared journey. "We save each other, Elias. That's what love is." They sat in a comfortable, companionable silence, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and gold. The story of the gala, of the slap, of the public fallout, had long since faded from public memory, replaced by newer, louder scandals. But the legacy of that night was not in the headlines. It was in the quiet, tangible realities they had helped to create. It was in the safe, warm homes of the families in Bayview. It was in the restored dignity of a woman who had been given a second chance. And it was in the profound, unshakable love of two people who had chosen, again and again, to answer cruelty, not with more cruelty, but with the radical, world-changing power of grace. The wind rustled through the cypress trees that lined their property, a sound like a gentle, contented sigh. Justice had been served, not in a blaze of vengeful glory, but in the slow, patient, and ultimately more meaningful work of healing. And in the quiet, golden light of the setting sun, Elara and Elias sat together, two quiet guardians of a better, kinder world they were building, one small, courageous act of love at a time.